Good afternoon. Good morning to our West Coasters and welcome. My name is Julie Miller and I'm Senior Vice President of Development here at WWF. Thank you for joining us for World Wildlife Fund's second, and I hope what will be our last, fully virtual Partner Symposium. And while we're still unable to safely gather in person for this annual event, we are so grateful that you have carved out time of your busy schedules to join us. This past year was exceptional, hard in ways none of us have experienced or really could have imagined, but also illuminating. We have great pride for the important work we have kept going, the new partners and support you all have provided, and the unprecedented public awareness for environmental issues that has emerged. We so hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and we can't wait until we can all safely gather again. This is actually our 8th annual Partner Symposium. For those of you who have attended previously, welcome back. We are so pleased that you decided to join us again. And to those attending for the first time, welcome. We are honored that you have chosen to spend this afternoon with us. Thank you for being here and for all that you do to ensure a brighter future for people and for nature. This symposium has always been about connection. And despite not gathering in person this year, is really no different. We hope the sessions this afternoon connect you to the conservation progress that you make possible, help you connect with other like-minded supporters, and connect you with the experts and leaders you will hear from in just a few minutes. To further connections between each of us and celebrate our shared love of the natural world, we ask you all to send in some photos of yourself in the great outdoors. We've taken those beautiful photos you submitted. Thanks for sending them. And we've compiled them into a brief video that we're going to play now. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the next few minutes filled with images of some pretty remarkable natural places and some equally remarkable people. Wow, what a lovely reminder of the collective power of this community. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Well, while we're only together for a few hours today, and that's not nearly enough time to discuss all of the conservation progress that you make possible, I hope you are taking advantage of the many other ways to connect and learn throughout the year, including our virtual Insider Series events, social media Q&A sessions, our amazingly wonderful magazine, and by connecting directly with those on our team who helped steward your support of WWF. We want you to be connected and well informed about the difference your commitment and generosity is making around the world. Now I'm honored to introduce WWF's President and CEO, Carter Roberts. Before Carter begins, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about him. Carter has led WWF since 2004. Carter's leadership, his vision, his understanding of the world's complexity push us toward conservation solutions, stand the test of time, as well as stand the uncertainties and pressures that we're feeling all around us. Under his leadership, WWF has worked alongside communities all over the world, with the private sector, with governments and civil society to safeguard the vast benefits nature provides for humanity and for the other species with whom we share this amazingly beautiful planet. Please welcome Carter Roberts.
Thank you, Julie. And good Lord, that introduction reminds me that the brood X cicadas only emerge once every 17 years. And it's now about 17 years since I emerged in the geography of WWF. But it's been an amazing period of time. I'm also reflecting on what the world will look like 17 years from now. But for now, I just wanted to give you a report out on the state of the organization, some really cool things that are happening, and some issues that it all raises in our work. And I do love that slideshow. And I particularly love the prairie chicken and the polar bear swimming right into your field of view. But it's great to see all of you and the great outdoors, which I know for many of us has been a salvation during COVID. So with that, I'm gonna just turn to our report. It is my practice to put an interesting creature on the cover of my reports. And this one is a particularly rare bird. I haven't seen it yet. It's the marvelous spatule tail. Its range is restricted to the headwaters of the Amazon in a small indigenous community that is working really hard with others to reforest the place where it lives. And if you have a chance to get to Peru and see this bird, you can have bragging rights and lord that over me, but I'm determined to see it in due course. Just a reminder of an amazing beauty of nature, and also the degree to which we depend upon local communities for its salvation. Next slide, please. My board has trained me to report the facts and nothing but the facts. And I usually present it in the form of this balance sheet of what's going really well, what are the big opportunities we need to jump on, and what are areas that we need to address. You could argue this isn't a balance sheet, but a different type of management report. But it's really helpful for me working with the board. We had a board meeting 2 weeks ago, and these are the more interesting highlights of what I reported to them. First, and I always say to people, my job and our job is mostly about attracting talent, supporting talent, cultivating talent, and giving talent the tools, and whether that's resources or the openings to do all the things they need to do in the world. And I'm pleased to report that there are a number of remarkable people that we've hired since the last time we spoke. And there are 4 people I'd like to mention. One is we have just hired in what is a groundbreaking hire in the world of conservation, which is an ombudsperson. And an ombudsperson is essentially someone who is a resource to local communities, particularly indigenous communities and marginalized communities, to when conflict occurs, for them to be able to reach out to notify us of conflict, and essentially the ombudsperson is an independent person within our institution that can be on the receiving end of those kind of reports or notifications, and then to work with us and communities in resolving those conflicts over time. And I'm pleased to report that after a very long period of recruitment, we hired the person that every other candidate referred to as the gold standard in the world of accountability conflict mediation, and human rights. And she is Gina Barbieri, who is a native South African human rights attorney who became the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation's ombudsperson quite a number of years ago, and is one of the most progressive and visionary people in thinking about how to make sure the voice of communities is at the heart of the work that larger institutions do. The other person I wanted to mention is Marcine Mitchell, who you may think that we keep plundering the International Finance Corporation, but Marcine is a native of Boston who went to a number of glittering schools and worked for a number of corporations, and then ended up running the whole climate change portfolio of investments for the World Bank IFC, and is an expert in blended finance and infrastructure design, and is joining as our head of climate change and really working with every part of our organization and doing what we need to do on that front. I'm also really happy to announce that Johan Berginus, a native of Sweden, has joined us. Johan has been an ocean expert for most of his career. He worked with Paul Allen, and Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, and his foundation in pioneering ways to use technology in the world of conservation, also ocean conservation, also worked with Henri Sala at National Geographic in creating big new protected areas in the world. And finally, with Henry Waxman and advising Congress and the incoming administration on nature-based strategies. And last but not least, Zdenka Piskulich, a native of Costa Rica, who is leading a groundbreaking partnership between us, the Nature Conservancy, Pew Charitable Trust, and the Walton family, and getting after large-scale finance and expansion of protected areas around the world. So in due course, I look forward to introducing you all to these folks in person, but let's just say we are really lucky to have them on board. Next slide, please. There are a number of others, next please. There are a number of other initiatives that we have underway, and among them is work that we are doing with the Biden administration and Congress, and working with governments around the world and upping the commitments on climate change, and also working with the private sector. There is a sea of new commitments in the private sector, not just to reduce emissions, but the new standard is to get to net zero emissions. And some of the largest companies in the world, and we're working with many of them. This combination of new government engagement and also deepened corporate engagement is a unique moment in time where we really feel like the wind is at our backs, and it's just a question of helping companies and governments deliver against the commitments that they've made. And we are working really hard, really long hours to help bring to fulfillment those commitments and to make sure those commitments and how they're achieved have real integrity. Next slide, please. There are two other things that we are doing right now that to me represent in some ways a real expansion of our notion of WWF as an institution. One is in the area of, as I mentioned, this large-scale collaboration to scale up and harness large-scale capital and commitments to expand protected areas, to strengthen the resources available to indigenous reserves, and to finance all of the above so that those parks, those reserves last and endure over time. And the other is impact investing. And these two taken together are a reconsideration of our role, that in addition to all the good things we already do, we also will not ultimately succeed in our work unless we find a way to harness the private sector capital, commercial investments, and large-scale philanthropic investments combined with government investments, and in a blended capital way, bringing all that together with private investments in the context of parks. So I just want to talk about these two areas briefly. One is this collaborative that we built with TNC, Pew, and the Waltons, and involves financing from Jeff Bezos, from the World Bank, from the Global Environmental Facility, the Green Climate Fund, and many governments around the world. It's the largest scale attempt to expand parks, to finance parks, and to get after those in a serious way. It builds on work we've done in Brazil, in Bhutan, in Peru, in Colombia, and that others have done in other geographies. And I couldn't be more excited about this. Next slide. We're looking at the geographies where we've already applied this kind of approach, and we're going to expand that in this collaborative, next slide, to include many, many more places around the world, and many, many more governments, and a blend of terrestrial and marine areas. Next slide. The way this works is we essentially look at park systems and what do they have now in terms of financing. Next. And then to look at what they require over time to be fully financed and fully functional. Next. And when we look at that difference between the green and the very tip of the blue, we realize getting governments to the point where they are financing those parks fully in terms of what they need will require extra incentives. It will require a performance-based mechanism. And what we are building is a syndicate of donors and commitments, that's the blue, that stepwise on a performance basis will create the incentives for governments to increase their appropriations, change their tax structures, increase their mitigation tools. Next slide, in order to close that gap over time. It may take 15 years, it may take 25 years, but we're repeating that in 20 different countries around the world. Next slide. The other thing is at the heart of this is the consideration of lining up this syndicate. Next. And you'll see the number of donors in the case of Brazil that came in on that deal, and then only providing that financing next when certain closing conditions have been made by the government. And this is the integrity at the heart of this approach. And we're repeating this country after country around the world to expand and finance their park systems. When you look at the impact in Brazil, in blue is the percentage of areas funded by this kind of mechanism, the percentage of deforestation in those areas compared to the percent levels of deforestation in the Amazon of areas that aren't covered by this program. And it is night and day, although it's worrisome with the Bolsonaro administration, even the percentage in the protected areas we've created has gone up. And it's clear we have work to do, but it's also clear that these areas fare better than the other areas over time. Next. I'll just touch on this in just this one slide. We're also working on building an impact investing mechanism. Actually, I'll show a second one that is all about putting nature-based solutions at the heart of harnessing private capital and private investments. We're going to do it at early stages in catalytic funding of innovative approaches to food production. And then on the right-hand side, we're also going to create a commercial partnership with an investment firm that specializes in natural resources, and to bring commercial scale investments, think 9-figure investments, that sit side by side outside of the parks we help create to deliver the kind of sustainable development we need in these countries. Really exciting work, expands the notion of who we are and what we do. But in addition to our traditional work, these are super important. There is an opening right now with all the commitments the Biden administration and Congress have made on nature. Next slide. Next slide. And these are some pull quotes from the Biden administration's campaign promises on getting to 30% of the world conserved, joining over 100 countries around the world in making that kind of commitment and doing that by 2030. Commitments to resilience, commitments to the nature-based solutions, and commitments to the restoration of nature in their work. Next slide. There is also the launched effort. The way this takes shape in our country is through the brilliant marketing, calling it America Beautiful. And this is a report from these agencies all about the profound importance of nature to reduce climate change, but also to provide resilience and livelihoods for local communities. Next. We could go on to one more slide, please. We are also in the middle of building a partnership with CARE that is going to be rooted, that's the vertical pillar, in the context of local communities next. That is all about mounting a singular intervention that builds on the role of young women and girls as protagonists in using technology, driving new forms of food production, and doing so in a way that increases communities' resilience to climate change and increases conservation of nature upon which they depend. At the same time, we're building a horizontal platform to build a global dialogue between the development world and the environmental world. Next slide. And advancing and providing a platform for local communities and indigenous communities for their voices to be heard. Next slide. When you move forward, let's go forward just a few more, all the way to issues to address. I really want to make sure on issues to address that we acknowledge both the profoundly challenging situation that we have in Brazil right now with the Bolsonaro administration, the need for us to expand the notion of the work that we do and the issues that we get after. And last but not least, to think about how do we operate in the future given COVID-19. It is a moment right now where the world is beginning to realize that the loss of nature is just as important as climate change in terms of affecting all of our lives. And it is an exciting time on both fronts and a time where we have a super important role to play. And I think at that point, I'll stop my report and open it up for questions. I know we have a limited amount of time left, but I imagine you might have some questions to ask. Thank you.
Great, Carter, thank you so much. I know we asked you to pack a lot into that short amount of time that we gave you, but we appreciate it greatly. And we thought we'd just jump into some questions. We've got several from the audience already, and those listening, if you'd like to submit a question, please do so. We have one question, Carter, that's asked about how COVID has really changed how we've operated. It says, COVID's changed almost every aspect of our lives. How has the pandemic affected our approach to conservation?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, I think the more the world learns about the root cause of zoonotic diseases and how they spill over from the natural world to humans, the more we understand that forest fragmentation, which brings people and their livestock in close proximity to wild animals, and the wildlife trade, particularly the illegal wildlife trade, are serious vectors in enabling that spillover to occur. And we are increasing the research, the science we put behind the connection between loss of nature and human health. We are working with governments around the world to prevent forest fragmentation, to end the illegal trade in wildlife, in addition to just building far greater tools to manage not so much this pandemic, but to prevent future ones. We've also gotten used to getting our work done without getting on a plane and traveling around the world. The last year before COVID, we were, as just our office in Washington, D.C., made on average 1,200 trips a year. Now, that's at least 12 times 2, usually more in terms of flights. Not only does it have great wear and tear on our staff, but it also is our greatest contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Finding new ways to connect with people around the world through technology, through Zoom and others, has been an incredibly positive thing in terms of the wear and tear on staff, and also in terms of the emissions that we create. Interestingly, it has also created a much better platform for people typically whose voices are not heard. And so we imagine that post-COVID, we will go back to a hybrid way of working, where staff will be expected to come together on some semi-regular basis to be with each other and work with each other. but to also have the flexibility to work remotely in a way that gives us a lot more flexibility in our lives, but also means we don't have to send an army of people to the UN climate summit in Glasgow, or an army of people to some gathering in India or wherever. And I think overall that's a good thing. Now, it has been really hard on staff, particularly those with young children or elderly parents. And we have worked on providing the care and the support and the flexibility for staff to be able to care for their loved ones.
Yeah. Thanks, Carter. We have another question related to your comments about Brazil and our challenges there. A large area of Brazil's rainforest burned in massive fires last year. These fires were human produced. How can this destruction be stopped if WWF has already been working on protecting the rainforest and it yet continues to burn? A challenge.
It's a great question. And at the heart of it is the reality, no matter what kind of partnerships we build with private sector, no matter what kind of the depth of our engagement with communities, that government still really matters a lot. And the current government of Brazil has been really aggressive in looking for ways to open up the Amazon, to open it up to agriculture as a way of rescuing their economy, to opening it up for new land ownership in a way that challenges existing parks and challenges indigenous groups and their rights and their reserves. And it has been a massively challenging moment for us and for the world. And you know, at this point, you yearn for leverage to and incentives for even this government not to go as far as they've gone, and to work with governors in states in the Amazon more than we have in the past, to work with the private sector and overseas markets to condition both trade agreements and the purchase of raw materials from Brazil. You know, don't forget, Brazil's the biggest force in their economy is agribusiness. And so to begin to change markets and to begin to create incentives for even this government to take the steps to do the right thing. It has been a brutally challenging time for us, and it has really shaken a lot of what we've worked on. And I would say one of the lessons learned is we have not devoted enough time in Brazil to build populist support and that treasures the Amazon and what the Amazon provides to the population there in terms of food security, climate stabilization, and dependable weather that brings rainfall to the crops that they need so much. A lot of work to do. And we're getting after it in partnership with many others and many other companies and many other governments. And it's a great question. We have not solved this one entirely.
Yeah, thanks, Carter. Jeff sent in a related question really about our work in Brazil, but I'm going to take this a little bit into a different pathway for you, just because I think our work with communities has never been more important. And I'd love for you just to end on your comments about the importance of that work and listening to the voices in those places where we work, and the critical nature of that relationship. If you just speak to that, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll end on this question.
So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, there are those like E.O. Wilson who have set forward a vision that we get to, he calls it the half Earth premise, that half of the planet is set aside, whether in sustainable use reserves or indigenous reserves or parks, in areas where nature is safeguarded as a principle in how those lands are managed. The first step in getting there is this 30 by 30 commitment by governments to get to 30% of the world by the year 2030. And all the math and all the analyses show that the only way to make real progress there is through work with indigenous groups, work with communities and lands that they own. If you just look at the math, by far that's the biggest wedge of progress that we could make, but it will only work if that work is not patronizing, it's not condescending, but our role is in support of those communities and their ability to generate data that they own, their ability to gain financing for what they have, the riches of their territories, and that they find the right tools to do all of the above in a sustainable way. There is a lot of great progress being made on that front, but at the end of the day, it requires us to ensure that communities, not only that their voices are heard, but they have a seat at the table, the most important seat at the table, in how those lands are managed, how those programs are executed, and how evaluation of progress is made. And that throughout, from beginning to end, that they clearly benefit from whatever solutions are created. And I believe at the end of the day, that will translate into the kind of political support we need, whether it's in Brazil, or whether it's in Myanmar, or whether it's here in the United States, in the kind of political support that we need to ensure that governments, even through the natural changes that they go through, that they continue to value nature and ensure that nature has a primary place among the laws of the land and the enforcement of those laws over time. So we've made a lot of commitments to this work. It requires real discipline. More than anything, it requires a culture shift so that we don't see WWF as the main protagonist, but our role is a supporting role to communities who are ultimately the protagonists that will be in those places over not just the future coming decades, but over the coming centuries and millennium. So with that, I'm going to stop. Julie, thank you so much. My thanks to all of you for your support for our work. We could not do our work without you.
Carter, thank you so much. Thanks for the questions from the audience. And Carter, thank you for your leadership through the uncertainties and the perils and the challenges that we face as an institution. We appreciate everything you've done to guide all of us. So thank you for that. Thanks for your time. I know you're going to stick around and listen. So we appreciate this, and we're going to move on to our next session, but thank you.
Julie, can I just say one thing? In the past year, even with COVID and with your support, we had the best year we've ever had in terms of progress on conservation, in terms of financial support. And that is, it's an interesting fact that it has been the greatest year we've ever had in the 60 years in which we've been operating. Thanks.
Yeah, and we're so grateful to everyone on this call who's played a role in that and supported us through that. We know other institutions like us have not fared as well, and we are extremely grateful to you for the role that you all have played in that. So thank you. So now to our next session. In a moment, you're going to hear from Nick Sekhran, WWF's Chief Conservation Officer, and Catherine Blancard, our Senior Director of Strategy and Planning. Their session will provide an update on WWF's evolving conservation strategy to secure some of the most critical places on Earth, while also addressing the systemic global threats to nature. Now I'm honored to introduce Nick and Catherine. Nick Sekhran has spent his career working to protect the environment and transform the development of pathways of countries to ensure they are both greener and more equitable. This work has taken him to more than 45 countries around the world. Prior to joining WWF as our wonderful Chief Conservation Officer, Nick served as the Director of Sustainable Development at the United Nations Development Program, leading a team of over 200 staff dedicated to advancing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. In her role at WWF, Catherine Blancard connects conservation, communication, and resource mobilization. She collaborates with scientists and field teams, policy experts, corporate partners, community representatives, and communicators to drive action toward our mission. Prior to joining WWF, Catherine led the digital practice of a Boston-based public relations agency and developed messaging, thought leadership platforms, and communication strategies for the firm's mission-focused clients. Thanks to you both for joining us this afternoon. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Julie. You know, we are at an inflection point, actually a great moment for the environmental movement writ large, as citizens around the world demand action to save nature, to combat climate change, as governments make commitments in those directions, as corporations take action. Indeed, from a global policy perspective, we're in the midst of what some are calling a super year for nature. In January, President Macron of France convened the One Planet Summit. There, over 50 nations committed to the 30 by 30 agenda that Carter just spoke of, to protect 30% of the world's land and seas by the year 2030. Since then, President Biden has convened a landmark climate summit virtually, but signaling US leadership in the climate space and announcing mitigation targets for the US and bringing the US back into the climate fold. Later this year, we have major meetings addressing nature and climate change respectively. And we at WWF are at the table helping to shape policy, influence change, and I believe we're driving some huge gains which are benefiting our mission writ large. Now, I talked about the citizens movement that underpins our work. WWF commissioned with the Economist Intelligence Unit a report which was published just a few days ago on the International Day for Biodiversity, May 22nd. And that revealed that millions of people the world over are concerned about nature loss, that this number is growing, and that consumers are demanding more sustainable products. And while that growth is global, really important is that the most dramatic growth has been in emerging markets. It also showed that the public demand for action is rapidly growing, and we're seeing this through all sorts of campaign protests, petitions, donations, including to us, and we're very thankful for that support. Now, between 2016 and 2018, the global news media coverage of nature-based protests grew by a steady 7%, but between 2018 and 2019, that coverage jumped by 103%. Turning to corporations, the call for bold, decisive action by governments is having a major impact in terms of the work that corporations are doing. Last week, a Dutch court ordered Royal Dutch Shell to make deeper than planned cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. And recently, some 95+% of the shareholders of Bunge, which is a major US agribusiness commodities company, which brings to retail many of the commodities that you and I consume, they voted to take deforestation out of the supply chain. And this is the first for these trade groups and agribusiness firms of that sort, and is something, of course, wonderful to behold. Now, one thing we're looking at too is the impact that we can have by engaging with the finance sector. We've just launched an initiative with colleagues at the UN and with business, the financial sector writ large, to create a task force on nature-related financial disclosure, which will set the standard for valuing natural capital and then the natural capital that we depend upon for our economies. And in doing so, it'll help investors, banks, insurers, and companies understand the financial risks associated with the loss and degradation of nature, and in turn to integrate these nature-related risks into the calculus underpinning investment decisions, credit and insurance underwriting, and more. Now, you know, looking more broadly at WWF's role in all of this, we're at the center of so many things in the nature and climate space. We've been re-looking at our approach and our strategy, and Catherine will present that in a minute. Ultimately, our aim is to create a world in which people and nature flourish. It'll take a village. As formidable as WWF is and our network and so on, we are small fry compared to the movement as a whole. And the challenges we face are too large and complex for us to tackle on our own. And so for us, we need to work with local communities, indigenous people, NGOs, businesses, governments, academia, stakeholders from all walks of life as we continue to chase our mission. And we need to look at the conservation challenges that we confront through a systems lens, because there are no easy solutions. The challenges that got us to where we are today are challenges that are hard to unravel. And we need to look at the interface of the economy, of society, of the environment, of governance, of crises and more, as we seek to tailor-make our solutions in the places where we work. And with that, I'll turn to you, Catherine, to unpack the key pillars of our work.
Thank you, Nick. So as Nick mentioned, these are incredibly complex challenges and therefore require interconnected solutions. But for the sake of simplicity and for our organizing principles, we've rooted all of our work into two key pillars. The first pillar around place-based conservation is our work on the ground. We are trying to secure some of the most critical places on the planet for people and nature. And all of our work in this pillar has a couple key ingredients that really make it special. First, people are truly at the heart of our place-based work. We ensure that people and wildlife are co-equal beneficiaries for everything that we do. And we want to make sure that our work is truly locally led, along the lines that Carter was speaking about earlier, and making sure that communities have the support that they need to deliver the sustainable vision they have for their resources. Another element of our place-based work is that it's long-term in its thinking. We want to ensure that the financial and management systems that we put in place can endure complicated political changes, as we've seen in Brazil, again, something that Carter spoke to. And of course, we want these long-term visions to be climate smart. These places are going to look different in the future than they do now, and we want to make sure we're planning for that future state versus something that will likely transform. True to our roots, the places that we're prioritizing are really critical for biodiversity. And as a science-based organization, we are really making sure that our approaches are rooted in solid science and also testing some great innovations. And we want to contribute to scholarship as well. We recognize that we can't secure these places, we will not be successful in this work on the ground if we don't also tackle the challenges that threaten our planet as a whole. And so to give you some examples of those, we need to transform our food system. We need to be more sustainable in how we get our nutrition in order to feed a population of 10 billion people. We need different approaches to farming. We need to dramatically reduce food waste, and we need to change consumption and production patterns. And while you'll hear a little bit about our seaweed work shortly for its climate benefits, this also is one of our potentially disruptive solutions for food in terms of feed, in terms of protein source, in terms of packaging. So something very exciting. We also recognize in these whole planet solutions that we need to tackle infrastructure. Over the next 15 years, the amount of infrastructure on Earth will double, and that's really going to transform the surface of this planet. We want to guide infrastructure development so that it is ecologically sound, so that it is climate resilient, and so that it's inclusive. And as an example of this, we can look to Zambia, where we are helping chart a pathway towards sustainable energy solutions, promoting sustainable development and economic growth while still keeping the Luangwa free flowing, as an example. We also know that we need to help change business as usual and transform companies and the financial sector to be positive forces for nature. The task force that Nick just mentioned is a great example of that. And of course, another would be the climate crisis. This may be the greatest challenge of our time, and we cannot think about our work in places, we cannot tackle any of the other challenges without also thinking about climate solutions. So today, we're actually going to focus on two pieces of work, one from each of these pillars. We'll hear about our work to conserve tigers. This obviously takes place in some of these critical places. And while wildlife is really at the heart of this, we want to save those tigers, it's deeply entwined with local communities, their well-being, and their vision for the sustainable future of their landscapes. And then we'll also hear more about the evolution of our climate work and our growing climate portfolio. And we'll do that by starting with an introduction to WWF's new Senior Vice President of Climate Change, Marcin Mitchell.